No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace.
From Champaign to Chicago, activists are demanding law enforcement improve interactions with Black and brown people.
All Illinoisans will live in a safer and more just state with this law on the books.
This spring, Governor J.B. Pritzker signed into law a number of changes to policing in the criminal justice system, but some say it doesn't go far enough. From Illinois Public Media, this is the 21st at the Capitol. Hello, I'm Brian Mackey. I host the 21st talk show Monday through Thursday on NPR stations across Illinois. From time to time, we're taking our show from radio to television to talk about changes in state lawmaking that could affect you. Today, the quest for a better criminal justice system. It's been just over a year since a white Minneapolis police officer kneeled on the neck of George Floyd, an unarmed Black man, for 9 minutes, killing him.
No justice, no peace.
The murder led to protests across Illinois and around the world.
We have had enough. It's 400 years, enough. Finally, when is it enough?
Earlier this spring, Governor J.B. Pritzker signed into law changes to rules about policing. Chokeholds are prohibited. Police must intervene when another officer is using excessive force. Certain military equipment is off limits for police, and all law enforcement agencies must have body cameras by the year 2025. Joining us now to talk more about this is Dr. Nika Jones-Tapia. She's a clinical psychologist and managing director of justice initiatives at Chicago Beyond, which is an organization dedicated to helping young people achieve their full potential. Dr. Tapia, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
I want to begin with another element of your professional background. You're a clinical psychologist, but you were also the warden of the Cook County Jail for a time. How did you come to be in that role?
Well, I had worked at Cook County Jail prior to taking on the role of warden for about, wow, I'm guessing 9 years, and developed relationships with many of the administrators there at the jail, including the sheriff, and started working on his team in 2013 as the assistant executive director. And I was responsible for initiating programs specifically for individuals who were incarcerated with mental illness. And in 2015, made to be specific, he asked me to be the warden of the institution.
And I'm sure it's no surprise to you, the sheriff there has often referred to the county jail, which is one of the largest in the country, is also the largest mental health hospital in the country, sort of involuntarily in that position. Can you talk about, you've said before that you felt like your appointment suggested that people in power knew something was missing in the way the jail was run. Can you talk about what was missing?
Yes. Well, in 2015, it was a pretty nuanced idea to appoint a clinical psychologist to lead a correctional institution. And many people applauded that notion. And to me, that suggested that the larger society, in their applause, recognized that something was missing. And if you just get the right people in a position of authority, you can fill that gap of humanity specifically. And for the 11 and a half years that I spent working in correctional institutions, that's what I tried to do. I tried to fill that gap of humanity. And it was at the end of my tenure, really, that I realized that and I believe nor could anyone else, fill that gap in the correctional system. I mean, don't get me wrong, like there were moments where I feel like we felt like we had wins. Like there were moments where we felt like we had reinstilled hope in people, but those moments are fleeting because the criminal legal system has such a deeply entrenched resistance to sustain change.
Is it fair to say that you took that appointment, and you've written about being ambivalent about it, and your father convinced you to take that appointment ultimately? Is it fair to say you believed in the possibilities of reform going in, and maybe that changed during your tenure?
I think when I first started working in corrections in 2006, that is when I really believed in the possibility of reform. But it was over the course of years, and quite possibly before I took on the role of warden in 2015, that I realized that reform wasn't coming easy. Cook County Jail, like many correctional institutions across the country, um, has leadership that believes in reform and has leadership that believes in the hope and the possibility, but that doesn't always translate to staff, and it doesn't always translate to policy and procedure. And one of the areas in which I wish I had done a better job during my tenure was truly engaging community in the work that we were trying to do in terms of reform. And that is where I believe you can have some more um, reforms that will actually last a little longer.
So, I wonder if now, do you still believe it is possible to reform the system, or are you more in the idea that the ultimate goal needs to be abolition of jails and prisons and the entire criminal justice system as we know it now?
You know, I even though we had some wins, I feel during my tenure as warden, and I believe the jail, even since my departure, has had some wins, and I'm sure other correctional facilities feel that they have made some changes. Um, those changes don't endure, and the very things that I, as warden, was looking at reforming in 2015, someone to reform it in 2006. And so what I recognize is that what was enduring were the roots by which this system was built, and that's punishment, that's disconnection from people and community that affirm a person's self-worth, that's inhumane and intolerable conditions by which we force people to live and eat and commune in these facilities. There was no enduring humanity or dignity. And for that reason, I firmly believe in the abolition of the system because it causes immense damage to not just individuals, but whole families and communities.
And this is one of the reasons I was so excited to talk to you about this today, is because you're somebody who has been in both of those worlds, right? Believing in the possibilities of reform, coming to think that abolition is the only ultimate endpoint we can reach. And there seems to be a debate right now among people who want to see a better criminal justice system, want to, change the way it is now. This idea: can you make space for people who believe in abolition and people who just want to reform at the same table? And you talked about this on a panel earlier this year. You said, in order for us to uproot the system, we have to create space for practitioners and theorists of criminal justice and abolition to commune. Can you expand on that?
Yes. So, based on my experiences, not just being a warden of a correctional facility, but also having people who I love and care for also incarcerated, I know that reforms are good. Like, I would not want my loved one to live in the conditions by which many of our nation's jails and prisons exist today. Reforms push us towards increased transparency, they push us towards increased accountability, and we recognize, I recognize where reforms have fallen short though. Because when you get those small wins, we sometimes celebrate so much that that's where we stop. And I believe we have to im- reform to move towards abolition, but not stop. We have to keep our eyes on um, the ultimate community in which we want to live. And that community shouldn't include a system of punishment like we have now. And people who identify as abolitionists Some have welcomed me in conversations and some have not because of my history of being a system actor. And my call during that panel discussion was for the communities to come together because I truly believe we ultimately want the same thing, and that's to have a system that's rooted in healing and that healing to start in our communities.
I want to ask you about that, rooting it in healing and communities, because this is another interesting aspect of what you've been writing and thinking about recently. When you talk about what needs to change in correctional institutions, short of abolition, right, jails and prisons, you talk about harm reduction, and not just for the men and women inside, but also the staff and for families and for communities. Can you talk about those connections inside the walls and outside the walls and how that feeds into each other?
Sure. I believe that the traditional notion of trauma is very much so individualized. It's a person's experience of a pretty devastating event and how they deal with it. And what I witnessed and what I experienced in my tenure in corrections was that trauma of the criminal legal system impacted everyone who was touched by it. It most impacted the were incarcerated, but it also impacted staff. Look, correctional staff have a life expectancy that's 20 years shorter than the general population, even though that research is dated, which is a problem in and of itself. They have higher rates of substance use, higher rates of suicide, higher rates of divorce. The list goes on. And so we ignore the impact of this system on the people who work in these facilities. And because each of us, myself, the people who are incarcerated, the people who work in these facilities, each has people who we love who live outside of those jail or prison walls that extends into communities. And so, very much so, what happens in these correctional systems impacts communities. And that is my call for harm reduction in these communities. I think people have historically ignored what has happened in jails because there's really been no call for increased transparency. And two, there's really been no realization that community has to be a part of what happens in jails and prisons. And then lastly, because people have historically envisioned people who have been incarcerated as those other people over there. And they haven't really experienced or acknowledged that what happens to people who are incarcerated happens to us, that they are community members, they're our family members, they're our loved ones. We cannot afford to continue to otherize people who are incarcerated.
We've been speaking with Dr. Nika Jones Tapia, Managing Director of Justice Initiatives at Chicago Beyond. Dr. Tapia, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Coming up after a short break, we'll hear another perspective on the push to improve Illinois' justice system. More to come. Stay with us.
News moves fast, and so does your schedule. Keep up with the 217 Today podcast weekday mornings. It's 10 minutes packed with the latest news and weather from the WILL team. Plus, one deeper dive into agriculture, education, health, and topics across Illinois. Download the 217 Today podcast from Illinois Public Media, your source for quality, trusted journalism.
Welcome back to the 21st at the Capitol. I'm Brian Mackey from Illinois Public Media. Today we're talking about the drive to improve criminal justice in Illinois. Joining us now is Garion Gatewood, Executive Director of the Illinois Justice Project. Owing to pandemic safety protocols, he joins me now from Chicago. Thank you for taking the time to be with us.
My pleasure, Brian. It's always a great honor to be on the 21st and happy to be here with you.
So I want to start by asking you about the past 10 years in criminal justice in Illinois. It was February 9th, 2013. There were 49,401 men and women incarcerated, locked up in Illinois prisons. 49,000. As of January 1st, that was down to 8,000. That's a huge reduction. What do you attribute that sea change in how Illinois um, treats people who have broken the law?
So I think we can attribute it to quite a few things. I think we can attribute it to leadership. I think we can attribute it to a better understanding of the economic values. And I think we can also attribute it to the advocacy community. And we'll go piece by piece on those. It takes great leaders and it takes true leadership to actually reimagine what the Department of Corrections can be. We've seen we saw those massive numbers you talked about not very long ago, where now in DOC put out a statement earlier this year where it said literally this is the lowest population they've had since 1991. That is massive, right? To see a decline in that population, to see so many people coming home and doing positive things. We've also had leaders who have educated themselves and educated their administrations on reentry and the need for positive reentry. Now, we saw at the beginning of the COVID pandemic that there was a need to really map out what a true reentry system is in Illinois. And it goes to a lot of the work that was being done by the Safer Foundation, Task, and of course, the Illinois Justice Project and some of our other partners in and around the state. If not for that quality leadership out of the governor's administration and the lieutenant governor's administration to really think about how we get some of those people out of the Department of Corrections and do it in a way that increases public safety and creates public safety for all, we wouldn't be here. So you think about the leadership over in DOC now, freshly confirmed, Director Jeffries, the confirmation was just on May 31st. You think about some of his visions and some of the things that he's wanted to do. Coming in from another state and trying to lead a massive department during the middle of a pandemic is tough. But again, he's been at the head of a lot of that change to get this massive reduction in the population. So he's done great in that regard. He has not been afraid to take questions head on. He's not been afraid to have conversations, some of the tough conversations with the advocacy community. And he's not been afraid to be held accountable by the advocacy community. As you well know, Brian, the advocacy community does not have any problem at all holding anybody accountable. And he's kind of taken that in stride, learned from some of the things and try to continue to make a positive impact on the overall population in DOC. So that goes to the leadership piece.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, but let me ask about leadership then, because it's not just Governor Pritzker. A lot of this reduction took place under Governor Rauner before him, and there has been this. And Governor Rauner, of course, had this commission looking at ways to reduce the prison population, and there has been this bipartisan consensus in the United States where you've actually seen, the Koch brothers, who are sort of somebody that the liberal groups often point to as like the root of all that's wrong with politics and money in politics, but they have been teaming up with people on the left to talk about ways to reduce the people who are involved in the justice system. I wonder, though, how you rate the chances of that bipartisan consensus on criminal justice continuing, or I wonder if you see the way the big police overhaul that was signed into law earlier this year, maybe that already signals that the alliance is fraying somewhat.
Well, I would think that you can continue to see a massive change in criminal justice reform from both sides of the aisle. It just has to make sense to folks, right? There are things that we've seen in the criminal legal system that have, quite frankly, not worked. It has been remarkably expensive, remarkably ineffective, and now people are really starting to open their eyes and see the current system and the system we've worked with in the past has been really flawed. So as we think about how to improve it, as you mentioned earlier, the Safety Act was a big step in that direction. Now, the Safety Act encompassed a lot of things, including police accountability, bail reform, sentencing structures, you name it. A lot of things were included in there, and that was by design, because there have been so many things in the criminal legal system that have been wrong. Of course, you may be aware there was a trailer bill that was recently passed through the Illinois General Assembly that went back to look at some of those issues. That is still going on now. So, people are still kind of looking at what was included in there and how you build up from that point. But I think we are at a place in the state of Illinois to be a leader where we talk about we have some stats say we have over 4 million people in the state with a criminal record. How has that improved public safety? How has that improved our economic viability? How has that helped the state grow? So when we start to ask those questions that people on both sides of the aisle understand, we can come to a consensus. One of the things a mentor of mine told me when I first came back to Chicago, and she said, even when you're having negotiations, she said, be quiet and listen to the other side because most times, if there's 10 items on the table, you agree on quite a few of them. So knock out the things you agree on, and we can do the harder work later on the items that we don't agree. So I do think there is still a pathway to continue to get major things done because even with the passage of the Safety Act, we didn't eradicate racism. We didn't eliminate improper use of force. We didn't eradicate a lot of these negative things that have caused our criminal legal system to be as massive as it is now. So there's a lot of work that's still left to be done. So people have to learn to work together. People have to learn to compromise, and we have to move as a unit.
And the Safety Act, just to remind viewers, is the big overhaul of criminal justice and policing that was passed earlier this year. I wonder, how concerned are you about rising crime rates? This is something that has been a story recently. Part of me says it's difficult to know. There was, if you follow media, particularly in the Chicago area, in the last year or so, there's been this focus on carjacking, right? And it makes it seem like it's this huge threat. And part of me never knows, is that just groupthink of media coverage or an actual increase in crime? But now we are beginning to see some statistics coming out that crime is going up, particularly violent crime in some places. Does that endanger the push to make a more humane justice system?
I think the rise in crime or the reported rise in crime does a couple of things. It makes us ask the question around what is public safety. Now, we've heard a narrative on public safety, and I appreciate that narrative, but what I also appreciate is public safety for all. So what's it mean to have public safety for every community, not just in Springfield, not in certain parts of Chicago, even in Decatur, right? All parts around the state, Rockford, you name it. What does it mean to have public safety for all? What is causing these reported rises in crime? Are we looking at economic downturns, a lack of economic upward mobility? What are the resources and supports we're putting in these communities where we see these spikes? Because I assume, let me not say I'm sure certain, because I hadn't seen the data, but I assume that you will see a heavy police presence in some of those communities as well. So there's an issue there, right? If you see a heavy police presence and you see a rise in crime, clearly those things aren't working together. So we need to take a step back and figure out how we actually get public safety for all, how we get the resources in places that are needed, and how we kind of push back on this narrative and push back on this idea that there's constantly something wrong. We have to think about what the root cause is and get to the core of that.
Yeah, safety for all. That's such an interesting point because I mean, you look at the history of policing. Arguably, it was protecting rich landowners in the past, and there are certainly neighborhoods that have not experienced policing in the same way as others throughout the state. But I do wonder if a rising crime rate, it sort of maybe forecloses the the room that people have to try new policy ideas, right? If elected leaders feel they have to respond to public and media outrage, doesn't that sort of limit the range of possibilities for what people are willing to try?
So I think that comes down to the advocacy community and the leaders who are elected officials to think deeper about what caused this. We can't always be reactionary. If we're all reactionary, we never, ever truly solve the problem because it's cyclical, right? You look back 10, 20, 30 years ago, you see some of the same trends going on and over again. You saw people calling for harsher sentences, not talking about closure rates on crimes or how successful we were at solving issues. What are we actually addressing here, right? Now, are we doing this as a reaction to make people feel safer? But like I said earlier, there are 4 million people in Illinois who have a criminal record, right? So what are we doing to actually make people feel safer? What is the work we're doing to make people feel safer? Are we having conversations in communities about what public safety means? And are people having conversations with their constituents about what public safety means to them? What can be done? What's a corresponding model? Because I want to be able, if something is going on in my house and something's going on in my neighbor's house, and we call the police, and let's say it's the same interaction, right? The same issue, same reason we call. I want to make sure we have the same interaction with the police when they come to those homes, right? So what's that actually look like? So increasing penalties or closing our minds to creating a new system that is just and equitable for everybody does not solve that problem. These are culture issues. We have to address the culture issues, the root causes of these, the rise in crime and the root cause of why policing is different in certain communities. We have to address that head on. Otherwise, we'll keep repeating ourselves.
Gary Gatewood is Executive Director of the Illinois Justice Project. Thank you so much for being with us.
Always a pleasure, Brian. Thank you.
Join us for the radio version of The 21st. It airs Monday through Thursday at 11 a.m. on WILL AM 580 and NPR stations across Illinois, or on the web at 21stshow.org. For all of us at Illinois Public Media, I'm Brian Mackey. Thanks for watching.